أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to episode 3 of the Eschatology podcast. And what I want to look at today, inshallah, is the concept of a science. What is a science really? And if you do a search, you will find some of the standard definitions, which are mostly from the secular world, where science is defined as something that is a systematic and organized structure or a body of knowledge that seeks to understand the natural world through empirical observation, experimentation, the formulation of testable hypotheses, theories, and the likes. And it is a disciplined approach to investigating and explaining the phenomenal occurrences in the physical world. And it encompasses a wide range of fields, including physics and chemistry, biology, astronomy, geology, psychology, and more and more. Now, this definition is limited, and it should be understood that it is limited to what should be rightly termed as material sciences, not all sciences. So one of the things that has happened in the modern world as part of a crisis of knowledge is that sciences have been delineated or reduced, and this is part of a reductionist epistemology that the modern world adapts, have been reduced into a form of material sciences only, so that only that which is materially observable, materially experimentable, or can be materially testable with a hypothesis, only that is what's considered as a science. However, in the Islamic tradition and in many of the previous dispensations, science is encompassed a much more broader and wider spectrum. But let's look at the material sciences. Let's look at what the key characteristics are of material sciences, because those key characteristics are also applicable in other sciences to a certain degree or a measure. One of the things is having empirical evidence. Material science relies on empirical evidence that is obtained through observation and experimentation. It emphasizes the importance of gathering of information or gathering of data from the real world to support or to refute a hypothesis or an assumption or a supposition and all the theories that are built on those. So this is reliant typically on the sensorial activation, what the senses can pick up and how much the senses can gather. And then all that is gathered, it has to be verified, it has to be tested to ensure that what is collected by the senses through observation, and that observation includes what the eyes see and what the ears can hear and what the nose can smell and so on and so forth. So this is called systematic inquiry. Scientists will follow a systematic and methodical approach to investigate natural phenomena. This will typically involve formulating research questions, targeted research questions, specific questions that are targeted towards the conclusions that are desired. And then they will design experiments based on that, and then collect data and then analyze all the results. Then they will be able to test the hypothesis, and the hypothesis itself must be testable. So scientific hypotheses and theories, they should be testable and should be falsifiable, which means that they can be subjected to experimentation and be potentially disproven if the evidence contradicts them. And so each hypothesis or each theory cannot itself be an absolute truth. It must be testable and it must be falsifiable. So anyone who comes up with any theory and says that this is the absolute truth, what they're essentially trying to say is that they're building a wall or a barrier around it to say that this is the truth, it should not be tested and it should not be falsified, which makes it a false theory in and of itself, because it should be tested and should be falsifiable by the evidence that is provided. And then there is such a thing as peer review all scientific findings are subject to a peer review where other experts in the field of those related sciences, they evaluate the methods, they evaluate the results of the research that is done before it is published in the contemporary age what are known as scientific journals. And this process helps to ensure the quality and the reliability and the authenticity of what has been derived or what has been deduced. Ultimately, the objective is to minimize any form of bias or personal belief or individual subjective opinion in the research process. And so it is meant to provide an impartial and evidence-based understanding of what is happening in the world, because we're all looking at the same phenomena and each individual has got their own subjective eye from which they are examining the same phenomena. But what is that phenomena in its objective aspect? What is it? Not what you think it is. So each of us could be looking at the same thing. We could be looking at water boiling, and then each of us comes up with our own idea of what we think is happening. But then the science has been established to determine not what we think is happening, but what is really happening by itself, objectively, without any subjective or bias interference. And then there is the accumulation of knowledge. So scientific knowledge builds upon previous discoveries and is cumulative in nature. And this is the nature of every science. No science is definitive. No science is such that once it has been done by a group of individuals, another group of individuals cannot come and contribute anything more to it. Not just in terms of discovery, but also in terms of an expansion of understanding. Because many things might be discovered, but are not easy to understand or are not easy to replicate or to articulate or to explain. And so it is always accumulative, if not in the components of the science, then in the articulation of those components. And so there is always new research that can be brought in to the existing body of knowledge, which can lead to revisions or refinements of existing theories. And in many cases, you find that these theories are either overridden or new theories are brought in to, let's say, provide an alternative perspective on a certain theory. And this goes on and on until something that is concrete can be established. Now, material science is primarily focused on the natural explanations for phenomena and events, but does not take into account supernatural or mystical explanations. This is what they term it as. They term this as supernatural or mystical, which is essentially the opposite of the phenomenal or the natural and the eventual, which can be deduced based on its causes to its effects. To suggest that something happened whereby a material cause was not established as to how it happened is considered to be a fallacy in material sciences. And this is what they call methodological naturalism. It is heavily reliant on naturalistic aspects only, and anything other than that is completely discarded. And it's one of the reasons why you have this constant battle between church and science in the Christian world. This was not there in the Muslim world. In the Muslim world, even material sciences, though they were subject to scrutiny under religious eye, there was no conflict between the two to say that this is a dichotomy. These are two different or opposing worldviews. To say that science and religion just cannot meld. They cannot come together. They cannot sit at the same table, which is not something that was ever considered a case in the Muslim world. But in the non-Muslim world, particularly as Christianity itself underwent its own transformation of secularism, this dichotomy starts taking place whereby the two are seen as polar opposites. And so material science itself does not accept any form of supernatural explanation to an occurrence other than what can be empirically proven. And this is the idea of using one source of knowledge primarily and disregarding the other source of knowledge. We have got two sources of knowledge, what is derived from human reason and then what is derived from revelation. what comes from the externality and what comes from the internal aspect, or rather what comes from sensoria and then what comes from spiritua. So the spiritual knowledge, which is revelation, is something that modern science completely neglects, and that not just neglects, denies its existence, on accord of denying any form of knowledge that comes via revelation. But one thing that is attested to material sciences and modern science is its reproducibility. Scientific experiments and findings should be reproducible by other researchers, allowing for independent verification of results. So what that means is that if somebody hypothesizes something about a natural occurrence and they build a theory and then they carry out an experiment and then they have certain results and they publish those, that entire process should be reproducible by somebody else independently, meaning each and every process, each and every step, they should be able to carry it out by themselves. It's not a unique thing that only one individual or only the individual who discovered it or came up with it is exclusive in his findings and therefore has a hegemony of knowledge. If that is the case, then such a theory is just simply disregarded. It's not taken into account. Now, the reason for giving you all this is that some of these principles are applicable in all of the other sciences that the modern world does not acknowledge. And of course, I'm referring to, in this case, the spiritual sciences or the religious sciences. Under that umbrella, we would give science a slightly different definition. In essence, a science is a structured language with its own terms and its own grammar and its own logic in a framework, in a smaller framework of a broader language, whichever dominant tongue in which the science is articulated, this being a particulate framework in that language with its own specific terms that provides the intellect with parameters within which to function when carrying out an investigation. So if the intellect is carrying out an investigation in the physical world, the universe, for example, then the science of physics provides the intellect with parameters, boundaries, indicatives, directions, what to do, what not to do, and so on and so forth, how to function in terms of its intention of investigation. The same would be true, let's say, for astronomy. If the intellect was investigating, let's say, numbers, then the science of mathematics would come in play. If the intellect was working on, let's say, the human anatomy, then let's say biology or something, or human anatomy as a science itself would come into play. So each science is a language with a collection of terms, words, rules, and standards which allow the intellect to operate within sound boundaries. And that's essentially what a science is. Now, science itself, it's not an object. And you find this fallacy used in many statements and slogans. Science has discovered this, or science tells us this, or science tells us that. Science does not tell you anything. Science does not discover anything. Science is not an intellecting body by itself. It is غير عاقل. It is a subject. Science is a subject. The scientist is the one who goes in and then comes up with different configurations to then tell you this or to then tell you that. So it is the scientists who are coming up with the theories. Science itself is not coming up with any theories. It is the scientists who are coming up with the discoveries. Science itself is not discovering anything. And this is part of the way the world and people in this modern world are now transforming themselves by becoming, forgive my language, stupider and stupider, because they do not think about the language that they're using. They use these words and slogans without really thinking about what do they actually mean. What do you mean when you say science is discovering, or science tells us this? And I've seen this a lot with many Muslims who try to use this as a means to sort of justify or to prove or to give evidence to what the Quran is saying. They'll say things like, oh, the Prophet ﷺ said this and that, now science tells us this and that. And then they'll say, Sadaqa Rasulullah, Subhanallah, who could have told the Prophet this? They'll say things like that. The Quran says such and such, the Quran says this, that, and the other. Now science tells us, oh, the Big Bang Theory happened like this, or science tells us that this is what happens here, or science tells us this is what happens there. And it's really ridiculous. And it's remarkable that even scholars who would not really be fitting of the word scholar in this case, they also use the same language. And it's sort of a romanticizing of the religion. Whereas in the past, our scholars, our true scholars, they didn't use science to validate what the Quran was saying or what the Hadith was saying or what the Prophet ﷺ said. Rather, they used the Quran and then they used the Hadith to validate what the scientists of their age were coming up with and what theories were prevalent. They used that basis, nurun ala nur, the light of revelation over the light of reason, the light of revelation standing in judgment over the light of reason, meaning revelation sitting in judgment over science. Because science, which is ciencia, is directly translated to ilm in Arabic. Ciencia is the Latin word, and then ilm is the Arabic word, and both are scholastic languages, and so these two words are translatable. But there is a difference then between ilm and ma'rifah. And so the Quran provides you with ma'rifah. But the ilm in this case only gives you the outward knowledge. It doesn't really give you the true ma'rifah, the understanding or the comprehension or the light of unveiling that takes place within the heart. And so science does not sit in judgment over truth. Rather, science, we would say, is only a facilitator that allows you to journey towards your destination of truth. In the same way that the science, because the science provides you with the what and how of things. And I'm going to talk about this in another session, inshallah. The what and how of things. What are the parameters? What are the objects? What are the pitfalls? What are the ups and downs? What are the issues to be dealt with? And then how are they all dealt with? Is it this or is it that? It gives you all of this, what you would call semantic knowledge. But then there is the why question that takes you from the logos, the outward of things, into the inward realities of things, and that cannot be provided by scientific inquiry. Scientific inquiry only enables you to journey part of the way. The rest of the journey has to be done on a spiritual level. Now, what has arisen from the modern age, which is something that has been established by a sacrilegious, a very crude and detrimental, cancerous ideology, which is to establish science as an objectifying factor of our existence, and then to associate science with technology, and then to override science with technology, hence to say that without technology there cannot be science, and therefore technology is the prime factor of human civilization. It is the cornerstone of human civilization, which is a false testimony. In truth, the cornerstone of human civilization is not science, and is definitely not technology. Technology is what we can do, techne, to craft, to make things, to make objects, or to make instruments and use those instruments to facilitate something. But that is not the cornerstone. That is only what we are able to do based on our understanding or our knowledge in this case, which is the ciencia. But that itself is reliant on language, which is why we say that a proper definition for science in the Islamic term would be that science itself is a language. And that language is a medium or instrument that facilitates learning. And this term is objectified by the same rituals as doctrine itself, and is established as the standard for judging everything, including now revelation. So they use science to judge what revelation should be and what revelation should say, and whether or not we should accept or reject it. Right? And this has always been a cancerous ideology, even insofar as the Muslim civilization is concerned. When we had the fitna of the Mu'tazilite, for example, the rationalists who always subjected and held the position that revelation should be subject to rational understanding, and if there is no rational understanding, then we reject it. So we only accept revelation based on if we understand it, which is a false epistemology. But science itself should be understood that it remains a knowledge of, not knowledge itself. And we're going to talk about knowledge and information in another session to expand more on understanding this particular piece. What is knowledge itself, and what is the difference between knowledge and information? Because what science will give you is information. It is a collective of information and is therefore subject to interpretation of that information. And so it remains a knowledge of things, because science is a subject and is not an object. The modern world has tried to objectify it, to turn it into an object, to a physical entity, to a thing by itself, which is false. Science is a subject, it is not an object. It is a subject of study which recognizes the limits of the truth. Facts, figures, theories within the subject, by definition, are always subject to change. The subject of study is therefore an instrument that facilitates the learning of the object that is studied. And so, regardless of whether the subject exists, it is not a requisite for the existence of the object, meaning that the object exists whether or not the subject to study it exists. And what I mean by this is, for example, if you take the universe, if you take the physical material universe, the universe exists whether or not the subject or the science of physics exists. Whether there is physics or there is no physics, the universe still exists. The physics is just a subject, it's another instrument that has been put in place in order to understand the object. If you take, for example, the entirety of human existence as a result of cosmological creation, and by definition, the study of the cosmos is as a direct result of human perception. Without human observation, the science of cosmology has no reason to exist. Regardless of which, the stars will still exist, even if cosmology doesn't. Hence, in reality, it is the object to be studied by the science as a subject. So we say that reality exists regardless of whether the science exists. It is an arbitrary construct, a noble one, and when I say arbitrary in this case, I don't mean something that is just frivolous. It is still a noble construct, but it is a human formulation, and therefore it cannot be taken as doctrine. And this is what the modern world is trying to do now, because they have gotten rid of scripture in their world. They have gotten this is the secularization of their lifestyle. They've gotten rid of the divine and the scripture, the revelation, which verifies what a reason comes up with. And so once you remove something, you have a void that needs to be filled. A doctrine has to be put in place, and so they put their own reason as doctrine. They're establishing science as doctrinal. Now, consciousness is something whose sole purpose is awareness, idrak, which itself is a realization, or what one would define as the knowing of the real, being aware of the real. Reality itself is a truth. It remains existent, as I just mentioned, whether or not the being is aware of its existence. The knowing is a process that takes the being from a state of not knowing reality to a state of the realization of reality. This realization, which is idrak, is not knowing reality per the subjective projection of the being, meaning you understand reality as you think it might be, which is a supposition of what you or I might assume what reality might be. Rather, it is the knowing of reality as it is. It is the act of knowing, and as such, the act of knowing cannot be equated to the act of naming, where the meaning is associated with a name. And I'm going to talk about names, the act of naming, and things that are to be named. But just bear with me for a moment. The act of knowing cannot be equated to the act of naming, where the meaning is associated with a name. Therefore, this which acts as a symbol to which meaning is affiliated. So between the knower and the reality to be known, there exists two entities, the symbol and the meaning, which unify the being and reality with realization. This entire process is carried out by the consciousness. So for one to say that they are consciously aware of reality, what we would mean by that is that we are harmoniously integrated with reality via the medium of knowledge. So knowledge is essentially the prime adhesive that connects the being to reality. Without a knowing of sorts, whether it is formal knowledge through the sciences or simple comprehensions, the being is disassociated from reality until he comes to know reality. And this is how science then facilitates the knowing as an instrument that allows the being to unveil from ignorance to enlightenment. And so if you look at the word ilm in the Arabic language, it's a very, very comprehensive word, and it's very broad and has got many meanings, and its derivatives and morphologies also have related meanings. If you look at the word alam, alam is derived from ilm, but alam is an ismu ala. Alam is an ismu ala, like you have miftah. It is a noun that facilitates the action. So miftah, which is the key, facilitates the opening of a lock, but is not the opening itself. So the miftah is not the fatih. The miftah is not the opener, it doesn't do the opening. It only makes it possible to open something. The act itself has to be performed by a conscious being. And so the alam is there as an instrument, as an ismu ala, which facilitates the ilm. So by abstracting the ilm from the alam, we are able to come to know the alam. And this is how we are able to advance our consciousness to a higher degree of realization, which is idrak. That if there exists a cosmos, an alam, then there must exist an originator of the cosmos. In other words, if there is an alam, then that is known via the process of knowing, which is ilm, its contingency, so long as it is rightly guided, will lead to a conscious realization, idrak, of one who originates the cosmos, Fatiru samawati wal ard, the originator of the heavens and the earth. So science has been instrumented not for worldly purposes, has been instrumented to facilitate a journey of knowing from a state of not knowing, ignorance, or a state of darkness, into a state of light, whereby you are able to see Allah Himself. And not see by the physical sight, by the physical eyes, but see with the heart, which is the idrak, which is the realization of the originator and the creator of the heavens and the earth. And that is really what science is about in our tradition. And it is important to understand this, because when we now go into, let's say, a specific science like ilm al-ma'ad or the science of eschatology, I'm going to explain now the science of eschatology in the next session. But when we go into the science, it is important to understand which perspective you are coming into the science with. If you're going to come in with the same perspective as the secular world, then the science is not going to give you its truth. You're going to get a lot of information, you're going to look at a lot of text, you're going to look at you're going to hear a lot of speakers on the subject, there are many theories, but you will not get what the science can really give you. Because as we said, it is largely an interpretive science, and it is dealing with metaphysical components which are not empirically measured, cannot be visualized, cannot be tangibly interacted with, and so cannot be experimented upon. It does not behave as a conventional material science. So if you're going to approach it from that perspective, it won't give you anything. But if you approach it from the perspective of understanding that this is science is supposed to facilitate a certain path for you, a journey for you towards a point of clarity, then perhaps you might succeed and reap from its fruits and its benefits. This is all the time we have for today, and we will resume in the next session, inshallah. Subhanaka wa bihamdika nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. ربنا تقبل منا إنك أنت السميع العليم، وتب علينا يا مولانا إنك أنت التواب الرحيم، برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. بارك الله فيكم، والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. جزاكم الله خيرا.